The calm before the inferno, February 13th, 1945, Dresden, Germany. The city lay under a thin, grey winter sky, its Baroque spires and Renaissance facades bathed in the pale glow of early evening. Smoke from the LB's factories curled lazily into the air, and the distant clatter of tram wheels echoed along the cobblestone streets. Major Heinrich Kruger, a 38-year-old officer in the Wehrmacht, adjusted his greatcoat against the bitter wind and walked briskly along the Neumarkt. His polished boots clicked against the stones, each step resonating in the near-empty thoroughfare. Normally Dresden was alive with the bustle of trams, street vendors, and the chatter of civilians, but tonight the city seemed muted, almost holding its breath. Kruger carried a small leather satchel containing maps, orders, and a personal notebook. He ran a gloved hand over the corner of his field cap, the fabric rough against his fingers. Around him, shutters rattled in their frames, doors closed too quickly, and the occasional figure hurried past, shoulders hunched, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Rumors had begun to circulate in the officers' mess. The Allies were planning something massive. Bombing raids had been escalating across the Reich, but Dresden, they said, remained safe, untouched by the worst of the air war. The city, with its cultural monuments and historic beauty, had been spared until tonight. As Kruger approached the LB, he saw the first signs of unusual activity. Smoke curled into the air, not the industrial smoke he was used to, but thin, dark tendrils that carried a bitter, acrid smell. Civilians glanced skyward, pointing toward faint silhouettes of planes far above the clouds. Even from this distance, he could hear the distant roar of engines, a steady, low hum that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He recognized it immediately, the droning sound of American B-17 flying fortresses, hundreds of feet above, invisible yet present. Kruger paused at Augustus Bridge, gripping the iron railing. The LB flowed dark and silent beneath him, reflecting the last glow of twilight. He noticed small groups of soldiers and civilians alike staring skyward, faces painted with apprehension. The atmosphere was taut with expectation, the city poised on a knife's edge. There was a palpable tension, a sense that Dresden itself was holding its breath, unaware of the hell about to descend. In his mind, Kruger reviewed the reports, the aerial photographs, the intercepted communication, yet nothing could prepare him for what was coming. He could not know the city's fate, the scale of destruction that would ripple through its streets, that would turn centuries of art, history, and life into ashes. A distant flash of light, almost imperceptible at first, danced on the horizon. It was followed by a faint, thunderous crack, a sound that made Kruger flinch. His hand instinctively went to the pistol at his hip, even though the sound was too far away to pose a direct threat. The air seemed to quiver, the faint winter wind carrying a strange, metallic tang. Somewhere far above, over 20,000 feet, Allied bombers began to align over Dresden, their formation precise, deadly, and relentless. Kruger took a deep breath and adjusted his scarf. He had seen war before, had marched through ruined villages, survived artillery barrages, and witnessed the human cost of conflict. But something about Dresden tonight felt different, ominous in a way he could not yet name. He glanced back at the Frauenkirch's dome, a perfect silhouette against the dusky sky. Soon he knew that silhouette would be swallowed by fire, and he, Heinrich Kruger, would walk through the aftermath. The first incendiary bombs began to fall in the distance. Tiny sparks landed on rooftops, then multiplied, spreading with terrifying speed. The faint hum of engines intensified, punctuated by the rhythmic pounding of explosions. Dresden was waking to a nightmare, and no one, not soldier, not civilian, would emerge unscathed. Section 2. The sky ignites. February 13, 1945. Dresden, Germany. The first bombs hit with a distant, almost deceptive dullness, like heavy stones thrown into a silent pond. Kruger's ears caught the muted thuds, before his eyes could process the smoke that began to curl from the rooftops. Then came the second wave, a shrill screaming roar, as incendiaries tore through the night sky, igniting the timber and clay of Dresden's tightly packed buildings. The city, celebrated for its graceful architecture, seemed suddenly fragile, delicate, like a porcelain model in a child's hand. Kruger turned instinctively toward the streets, and the scene that met him stole his breath. Flames licked the eaves of homes, twisting and flaring with unnatural speed. Sparks spiraled upward, drifting like embers caught in a sinister wind. Civilians screamed, clutching children, attempting to flee through narrow alleys, now choked with smoke and debris. The roads were slick with frost, but already cracked and charred from fires that were leaping from house to house. He pulled his greatcoat tighter and moved toward the center of the city, boots crunching over glass and splintered wood. The acrid smell of burning was overwhelming, a dense, suffocating heat that rose in waves, crawling through the streets and into every alley. He could feel it against his face, his lungs burning with each breath. A cart, abandoned in panic, had caught fire. The wooden wheels exploded, sending shards flying across the cobblestones. Kruger dove behind a ruined fountain, heart hammering, narrowly avoiding the deadly projectile. From above, the bombers maintained their relentless rhythm. The night sky was illuminated by streaks of fire, the city below broken into a patchwork of destruction. Kruger saw the Frauenkirche collapse in a thunderous roar, the iconic dome crumbling into flames and smoke. He wanted to shout, to warn the people around him, but his voice was swallowed by the chaos, the screaming wind, the crackle of burning buildings. He moved through the streets, almost mechanically, a soldier, trained for combat, yet utterly unprepared for this scale of devastation. Corpses lay haphazardly, some partially consumed by fire, others covered in soot, faces frozen in terror. The smell of charred flesh and wood combined into a nauseating miasma. A mother tried to drag her child from the ruins of their home, both covered in ash. Kruger helped them, feeling an unfamiliar pang of helplessness. The firestorm was relentless. Windows shattered, roofs collapsed, and walls buckled under the heat. Smoke spiraled into the sky, forming a black cloud illuminated by the inferno beneath. The city's streets, twisted and warped, as if alive, guiding the flames, trapping the citizens in a labyrinth of destruction. Even hardened soldiers, who had seen battles in Stalingrad and the Ardennes, were forced to pause, mouths open in disbelief, watching the city disintegrate in front of them. Kruger's notebook fell from his satchel, pages curling in the heat. He bent to retrieve it, brushing soot from the cover, but the words and diagrams seemed meaningless now. The organized maps of streets and supply routes meant nothing in the face of raw, chaotic annihilation. He felt an icy knot of dread form in his stomach, the realization that Dresden, this jewel of German culture and pride, would never recover. A sudden gust of wind carried a shower of burning embers past him, setting the edge of his coat alight. He tore it off, stomping the flames into the snow, heart racing. Around him, the city screamed. Fires reflected in shattered windows, creating the illusion of hundreds of small suns dancing in the night. The roar of engines and the pounding of bombs merged into a single terrifying sound, the voice of war itself. For Kruger, the familiar certainties of duty and honor were beginning to fracture. Dresden was not just another target, another battle. It was a monument to human history, a living testament, reduced to ash in hours. And as he stepped carefully over the broken streets, helping civilians where he could, he knew the war he had believed in, fought for, and lived through was changing before his eyes. Something fundamental, something irreversible, had shifted in the world that night.
Section 3. Walking Through the Ruins.
February 14th, 1945, Dresden, Germany. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Though the city remained cloaked in smoke and ash, Major Heinrich Krüger moved cautiously through streets that were barely recognizable. What had once been a proud, orderly city of spires, plazas, and elegant bridges was now a jagged landscape of fire-blackened ruins. Chimneys leaned at impossible angles, windows gaped like empty eyes, and the scent of burning lingered, heavy and unyielding. Bodies lay scattered among the debris, some partially concealed beneath collapsed walls. The cries of survivors, few and hoarse, pierced the still smoldering air. Krüger's boots crunched over splintered timber and molten glass. Each step was measured, careful. Each movement risked stumbling upon another human casualty or a hidden pocket of fire. He stopped at a square, recognizing it from memory. The Newmarkt, once bustling with vendors and townsfolk, now a scene of silent horror. Ash swirled in the wind, forming ghostly patterns around the skeletal remains of buildings. Krüger's thoughts were interrupted by the faint moan of a child somewhere nearby. Following the sound, he discovered a small boy trapped beneath a fallen roof beam. The child's face was streaked with soot, eyes wide and terrified. Without hesitation, Krüger lifted the beam just enough for the boy to crawl free. The child clung to him, trembling, whispering something incomprehensible through choked sobs. In that moment, Krüger felt the absurdity of it all. Years of military training, years of strategic planning, all brought to bear in the act of lifting a beam so a single child could survive. The war, he realized, had become something beyond victories and defeats. It was raw survival. Morality pressed against fire and smoke. The city's grandeur, so recently celebrated, was now unrecognizable. The Zwinger Palace, its ornate statues and fountains, once symbols of refinement, stood fractured and hollowed by fire. The Dresden Frauenkirche, Krüger's own pride of the city, had collapsed entirely. He walked past its ruins, the dome shattered, the interior a charred skeleton of what had once been an awe-inspiring sanctuary. The magnitude of the destruction left him speechless. A soldier unaccustomed to witnessing devastation of this scale in his own homeland. Survivors wandered like phantoms, their faces pale and coated with ash. Many had lost everything: homes, family, friends. Some tried to salvage belongings from smoldering ruins, only to drop them as another flare of heat ignited nearby debris. Fires smoldered everywhere, consuming wood and paper, and the air was heavy with smoke that stung the eyes and burned the lungs. The soundscape was surreal, a combination of distant collapsing walls, groaning beams, and the occasional desperate cry. It was the echo of a civilization unraveling before him. Krüger moved toward the Elbe River, the water reflecting the red glow of the fires still burning through the city. Along the riverbank, corpses of those who had fled the streets littered the frozen edge, frozen in terror, some partially burned. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a sense of guilt mixed with helplessness. He had trained to defend Germany, to fight against the enemy abroad, but here in Dresden, he could do nothing to save the city he had sworn to protect. Passing a ruined bookstore, Krüger paused to look at what remained of shelves once lined with volumes of literature, philosophy and history. Papers were blackened, charred, fluttering weakly in the wind. He knelt and picked up a fragment of a page, the ink smudged but the words faintly legible. A quote about hope and perseverance stared back at him, bitterly ironic in the midst of total destruction. He tucked the fragment into his pocket, a small token of memory in a city that had become almost entirely forgettable. As Krüger continued through the streets, the full scope of the firestorm became apparent. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, streets were impassable, blocked by rubble, walls and collapsed roofs. The city's famed bridges were damaged, and small fires still flared intermittently, reigniting debris that had not yet been fully consumed. He realized that Dresden's destruction was not just physical. It was psychological. Its beauty, its pride, its sense of order, had been erased in hours. For Kruger, the war was no longer a question of winning or losing battles. It was the realization that Germany itself could be brought to ruin in an instant, that the enemy could strike at the heart of its culture and morale with impunity. Dresden, Germany. Kruger's steps slowed as he entered a narrow alleyway, where the devastation was most intimate and unrelenting. Here the human cost of the bombing was unmistakable. Charred corpses huddled in doorways, frozen in postures of terror, while smoke rose from smoldering piles of clothing and personal belongings. The scent of burnt flesh and scorched wood was overwhelming, clinging to his uniform, his gloves, even his head. It was a smell that would linger in his memory, long after the fires were extinguished. A woman stumbled past, clutching a bundle of rags, her eyes hollow. She moved without direction, stepping over debris and the bodies of neighbors she once knew, muttering prayers under her breath. Kruger offered her his hand, and for a brief moment she looked at him, recognition, fear, and despair flashing in her gaze. Before she disappeared into the haze, he realized there were hundreds of these wandering souls, each carrying a story of survival or loss, each a living testament to the horrors inflicted that night. He reached a square where a church had collapsed into a heap of rubble. Children's toys lay strewn among the ruins, singed and broken. Kruger stooped to pick up a small wooden horse, its paint blackened by fire. He held it in his gloved hand, and imagined the child who had once played with it. If the child still lived, around him the city seemed almost spectral, frozen between life and death, between memory and obliteration. He could almost hear the echo of laughter, the ring of church bells, the murmur of street vendors, but it was all swallowed by the silence of ash and ruin. Kruger paused at a half-collapsed building where a family had clearly sought refuge. The doorway was scorched, the walls blackened, and the floor littered with debris. He saw the faces of the fallen pressed into the cold, hard stone. Some partially burned, others just collapsed in terror. He could not tell if they had died trying to escape the flames or from smoke inhalation. Either way, their deaths were absolute, final, and indiscriminate. He placed a gloved hand on the charred wall, feeling the heat that still radiated from the fire beneath, and an unfamiliar shame weighed on him. He had trained for war, understood orders, strategy and tactics, but there was no training for the obliteration of innocence on this scale. The sky above remained streaked with smoke, a thick gray curtain pierced occasionally by sunlight that turned the ash into glinting, almost blinding sparks. Kruger knew he was witnessing a turning point, not in a single battle, but in the spirit of the German people. The firestorm had shattered more than buildings. It had shattered confidence, morale, and belief in eventual victory. Dresden, once a jewel of European culture, had been rendered unrecognizable in a matter of hours, and the message was clear: no city was safe, no victory guaranteed. He moved toward the outskirts, where the fires had yet to consume every structure, and saw soldiers from his own unit helping survivors. Faces that had once shown pride and determination now reflected numb disbelief. Men who had faced enemy fire on the Eastern Front were shaken. Some crouched over dead civilians in stunned silence, others staring blankly at the horizon. Kruger realized that Dresden's destruction had stripped away the veneer of military certainty. War was no longer a contest of strategy and valor. It was chaos, destruction, and the cruelest twist of fate. Passing a street still smoldering from a particularly intense firestorm, Kruger glimpsed a man attempting to rescue a partially burned horse, dragging it through debris, while smoke wrapped around his frame. The absurdity of the scene, a human and animal struggling against the overwhelming force of a firestorm,
drove home the surreal reality of the bombing. Dresden was a city caught between past and obliteration, human and elemental forces colliding. And he, Heinrich Krüger, a soldier sworn to defend his homeland, could do little but witness it.
Section 5. The Firestorm's Heart. February 14th, 1945. Dresden, Germany. Krüger had advanced toward the city center, where the destruction reached its peak. The firestorm had become almost a living entity, consuming everything in its path. Heat radiated in waves, distorting the air above the ruins. Buildings that had survived the initial bombing now succumbed to the relentless inferno, their timbers snapping and hurling embers skyward. The streets were choked with smoke, so dense it burned the eyes and filled the lungs with soot. Breathing was laborious. Each inhale brought a metallic tang, like blood mixed with ash. He passed what had once been a grand cafe, its ornate facade now warped and blackened. Tables and chairs were fused together by heat, and menus curled into charcoal like sheets. The remnants of a chandelier hung from a splintered ceiling, swinging slightly as if mocking the silence that had replaced conversation and laughter. Krüger's gaze fell on a toppled piano, its keys warped and blackened. He touched a key tentatively, and it emitted a dull, hollow sound. Music silenced by fire, art destroyed in an instant. Civilians and soldiers alike stumbled through the streets, their silhouettes ghostly in the smoky haze. Some were screaming, some were silent, moving with the mechanical rhythm of despair. A woman knelt over a burning bundle, screaming as she tried to rescue what appeared to be family photographs, only to drop them as the flames consumed them. Krüger felt his stomach twist at the futility of it all. The firestorm paid no heed to memory, no respect for history or human attachment. At the Altmarkt, Krüger stopped to survey the devastation. He could barely recognize the city he had known since youth. The square, once bustling with merchants and townsfolk, now lay buried in rubble and smoke. The air shimmered with heat, and distant walls groaned before collapsing under the fire's unrelenting pressure. For the first time in his military career, Krüger felt a gnawing, unshakable doubt. This was no battlefield victory. This was annihilation. The pride of Germany's architecture, its culture and its people, all reduced to ash. He moved cautiously through the ruins, helping civilians where he could. A man trapped beneath a beam screamed for help, and Krüger and a few soldiers lifted it, revealing a young girl huddled in the shadows. Her clothes were singed and soot covered her face, but she clung to life with a stubborn resilience. Krüger handed her over to another soldier, and watched as she disappeared into the smoke. For every life saved, countless others had been extinguished. Each step through the firestorm left an indelible mark on his conscience. Above him, the sky was a fractured canvas of gray and orange, illuminated intermittently by the remaining fires. The roar of aircraft had subsided, leaving only the subtle groans of collapsing structures and the crackling of flames. Krüger realized that even if the bombing ceased, the destruction was far from over. The firestorm had created its own momentum, feeding on itself, spreading through the city like a living, destructive organism. He paused by the ruins of a bookstore, one of Dresden's many centers of culture and learning. The shelves were blackened, books reduced to ash and soot. He lifted a scorched volume, its cover barely legible, and ran his fingers over the burned pages. In that moment, the magnitude of the attack crystallized. Dresden was not just a military target. It was a symbol of Germany itself. The firestorm had stripped it of identity, reduced pride and history to cinder. And in the heart of this ruin, Heinrich Krüger understood something profoundly unsettling. The war had shifted, and Germany's illusion of invincibility had been irrevocably shattered. Section 6. The Weight of Silence. February 14, 1945, Dresden, Germany. By mid-morning, the flames had begun to subside, leaving behind a city transformed into a skeletal landscape. Krüger walked slowly,
boots crunching on ash and shattered brick. The streets once filled with life and commerce were now eerily silent, broken only by the occasional moan of a survivor or the distant collapse of a weakened building. The firestorm had burned with indiscriminate fury, consuming both civilians and the structures that had defined their lives. Kruger came across a group of soldiers from his unit, sitting in a ruined courtyard, their faces streaked with soot, eyes hollow from exhaustion and shock. None spoke, their silence more telling than words. They had seen Dresden burn, had witnessed a city's soul consumed in hours, and their training offered no guidance for the emptiness that now surrounded them. One of the men, Unteroffizier Miller, lifted a scorched photograph of a family, staring at it as if it were a talisman against despair. Kruger did not comment, knowing that no consolation could exist here. He moved toward the Elbe, seeking some semblance of order in the chaos. Along the riverbank, debris floated like grotesque flotsam, roof beams, furniture and fragments of life carried from destroyed homes. The water reflected the gray sky and the faint orange glow of lingering fires, creating a disorienting mirror of the city's devastation. Kruger bent to scoop water into his hands, washing the soot from his face. Even the simple act of cleansing felt almost sacrilegious amidst the ruins, as if the very city demanded he remember the horrors it had endured. Survivors emerged tentatively from hiding, their movements cautious, as though the shadows themselves might conceal further danger. Mothers called to children, men checked the bodies of neighbors and family members, and everywhere, the pervasive stench of ash and smoke reminded all who walked these streets that Dresden as they knew it no longer existed. Kruger realized that while the physical destruction was catastrophic, the psychological toll would endure even longer. Families broken, lives interrupted, and a population left with nothing but memory and despair. This was the true scale of devastation. Kruger paused before a partially standing church, its bell tower leaning at a precarious angle. The chimes were silenced forever, and yet the structure's shadow seemed to weigh upon him. He felt a sudden profound sense of the futility of everything he had been fighting for. Victory in war had always seemed attainable, measurable in maps and strategic objectives, but here in the hollowed streets of Dresden, all notions of triumph felt absurd, meaningless. The city's beauty, its culture, its very essence, had been destroyed, and no military success could undo the loss. He knelt beside the remains of a burned piano in the street, its keys warped and blackened. His gloved hand rested on them, and he imagined the music that had once filled the square. The thought made him ache for a moment. He felt tears sting his eyes, though he wiped them quickly away. A soldier, noticing his gesture, avoided eye contact. Pride, discipline, and stoicism were being tested, and Kruger knew that many men would never reconcile the acts of war they had witnessed with the values they had believed they were defending. The wind shifted, carrying ash and soot over the streets, blanketing the city in gray. Kruger inhaled, tasting the metallic tang of death in the air, and felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. Dresden was not merely a city reduced to rubble. It was a mirror of a nation's vulnerability, a stark reminder that no fortress, no pride, no cultural jewel could withstand the full force of modern warfare. And for Kruger the realization cut deep. The war he had believed in, the victory he had envisioned, now felt impossibly distant, fragile, and perhaps ultimately unattainable.
Section 7. Confronting the Unthinkable. February 14th, 1945. Dresden, Germany. Kruger's boots crunched across the frozen debris of what had once been a bustling thoroughfare. Around him, Dresden smoldered like a corpse laid bare. Walls leaned at impossible angles. Streets had disappeared under mounds of ash and rubble, and the distant roar of collapsing roofs punctuated the eerie silence. For a soldier trained to anticipate and engage with the enemy, this scene was something unquantifiable, chaotic, senseless, almost beyond comprehension. He came across a line of civilians huddled together in a ruined alley, faces streaked with soot and tears, eyes wide and unseeing. Among them was an elderly man, clutching a tattered coat, as if it contained all that remained of his life. Kruger knelt beside him and asked if he was hurt. The man only shook his head, muttering a prayer under his breath. Words felt useless here. The horror had rendered language inadequate. Kruger's thoughts drifted involuntarily to the Allied planes, the orchestrated firestorm that had fallen from the sky. He understood strategy, targets, and orders, but the immensity of destruction in Dresden went beyond military calculation. Entire neighborhoods gone, countless lives extinguished, cultural heritage annihilated. It was a level of devastation that no soldier could fully rationalize. And yet here he was, walking through its aftermath, forced to reckon with the human cost of a war he had long believed was just. A woman emerged from the shadows, clutching a small bundle. She collapsed sobbing onto the frozen ground. Kruger helped her to her feet, supporting her as they moved through the ash-choked streets. Around them, buildings groaned as fires beneath them continued to burn unseen. The sky, streaked with gray and the lingering glow of orange embers, cast a ghostly light over everything. The surreal stillness of the city, the quiet between the remaining flare-ups, was almost worse than the chaos of the previous night. Kruger stopped in front of a partially standing facade of a theater. The ornate stonework was blackened, windows blown out, statues reduced to fragments. He remembered attending performances here as a boy. The laughter, the music, the applause. Now only silence remained. He ran his gloved hand over the scorched stone, feeling the heat radiating from the rubble. A sense of futility enveloped him. If this could happen to Dresden, what hope remained for the rest of Germany? As he walked on, he encountered soldiers from other units, each navigating the ruins in stunned disbelief. One officer whispered to another, voice trembling, "This isn't war. This is something else." Kruger nodded silently. He could not articulate what he felt. Shock, grief, shame. But he understood the words perfectly. Dresden had become a crucible in which the illusions of victory and honor were burned away alongside the city's streets and spires. The Elbe River shimmered faintly through the haze of smoke. Bodies, debris, and remnants of life floated listlessly along the icy water. Kruger bent to examine the scene, a knot of despair forming in his chest. Here, the cost of modern warfare was laid bare, indiscriminate, unrelenting, and absolute. And within him, a seed of doubt grew, a realization that the war could not simply be won through strategy and discipline. It could be lost through overwhelming, unimagined devastation. Kruger straightened, his face streaked with soot and sweat, and surveyed the remnants of Dresden. Flames still licked at the edges of streets, and smoke curled in ghostly patterns toward the sky. He understood now, with a clarity that left him hollow. This night had changed everything. For the first time he questioned not just his orders, his duty or his loyalty, but the very notion of victory itself. Dresden had burned not only buildings and people, but also the illusion that Germany could endure unscathed. Section 8. The Aftermath of Faith. February 5. Dresden, Germany. By the morning after the firestorm, Dresden was a city unmoored from reality. Major Heinrich Kruger walked through streets that had been reduced to ash and rubble, where the air was thick with soot and the acrid scent of burned wood and human life. The fires had mostly subsided, leaving behind a landscape of blackened skeletons. What remained of homes, churches, and shops, now just charred frames jutting into a gray sky. Kruger moved slowly, absorbing the full scale of destruction. Entire blocks had vanished. Streets were unrecognizable, littered with twisted metal, broken furniture, and the remnants of lives abruptly ended. Occasionally, a survivor emerged, moving through the ruins in stunned silence, clutching the few belongings they could carry. Their faces told stories of grief, shock, and exhaustion, eyes hollow as if they had glimpsed the end of the world. He paused beside a crumpled carriage,
Its wheels melted from the heat and reflected on the human cost. Children, women, men, hundreds, perhaps thousands had perished in hours. The firestorm had swept indiscriminately through the city, leaving no distinction between soldier, civilian, or child. Kruger felt the familiar armor of military detachment slip, replaced by a profound sorrow he had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. Walking through the ruins, he came across the remnants of a library. Books, centuries old, lay blackened and curled on the ground, their knowledge and culture reduced to ash. Kruger picked up a fragment of parchment, tracing the faded ink with his finger. He had trained to calculate damage, assess strategy, and follow orders, but this destruction was beyond any measure. Dresden was more than a city. It was a symbol of German pride, art, and heritage, and now it had been erased. Kruger's thoughts turned inward. For the first time he questioned the war itself. Not the enemy's might, not the outcomes of specific battles, but the very purpose of the conflict he had devoted his life to. Dresden was supposed to be safe, a jewel spared from the worst of the bombing campaign. Its obliteration revealed the fragility of everything he had believed in. Victory, honor, glory, all seemed hollow in the face of such overwhelming loss. As he continued, he noticed small acts of perseverance amidst the ruin. A man pulled a child from the rubble of a collapsed building. A woman salvaged a scorched family photograph. These moments were fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet they carried a quiet defiance against the devastation surrounding them. Kruger understood that while the city had been physically destroyed, the human spirit, though battered, still lingered. But the realization that struck him hardest was personal. For the first time, Major Heinrich Kruger felt the certainty of military faith. Faith in victory, in the righteousness of his cause, arose. Dresden had burned not as a consequence of battlefield miscalculation, but as a deliberate, overwhelming act that exposed the vulnerability of everything he had defended. He felt as though the city itself had turned against him, or perhaps that the war had revealed the futility of his role in it. Kruger stood in the middle of what had been a bustling square, gazing at the skeletal remains of buildings that once held music, laughter, and commerce. The sun struggled to pierce the thick smoke above, casting an eerie light over the devastation. He closed his eyes and breathed in the heavy, sulphurous air. When he opened them again, the city looked unchanged. Ash, ruin, and silence. But something within him had shifted irreversibly. Dresden had not only been destroyed, it had destroyed his faith in victory.
Section 9. A Soldier's Reckoning. February 15th, 1945. Dresden, Germany. Major Heinrich Kruger walked on, boots scuffing against ash-covered cobblestones, navigating streets that were little more than jagged corridors of fire-blackened rubble. The skeletal frames of once proud buildings leaned precariously, as if the city itself were about to collapse entirely. The air was thick, tasting of smoke and burnt wood, clinging to his throat and filling his lungs with every breath. He passed a group of soldiers huddled in the remains of a half-collapsed church, their faces etched with disbelief. They had been ordered to assist civilians, but many of them were simply frozen in shock, staring blankly at the charred ruins around them. Kruger approached them, and for a moment, the men exchanged no words. Only the shared understanding of the unthinkable had passed between them. Kruger's thoughts drifted to the ideals he had carried into war: discipline, honor, and duty. They now seemed distant, almost irrelevant in the face of Dresden's obliteration. This city had been a jewel of German culture, a symbol of civilization and refinement, and yet it had been reduced to ash and ruin in less than 24 hours. He felt the weight of helplessness press upon him, heavier than any pack or artillery shell he had ever borne. He paused at a bridge over the Elbe, its stone supports scarred and fractured, but still standing. Below, the water carried floating remnants of the city, splintered furniture, charred timber, and the occasional lifeless body. Kruger stared at the river, its dark surface reflecting the smoky sky, and considered the lives swept away in hours of fire. The scale of loss was incomprehensible. Dresden was no longer a city. It was a testament to human fragility in the face of industrialized war. As he moved through the outskirts of the city, Kruger saw small, poignant signs of resistance against despair. A mother cradling her child amidst rubble, a man dragging salvaged possessions through ash-choked streets. Yet these acts, however human, were swallowed by the enormity of destruction. He realized that even if every life he could touch were saved, the psychological and cultural loss would haunt Dresden and Germany for decades. Kruger's mind returned to the events of the night before. The firestorm had been precise, relentless, and indiscriminate. Dresden's beauty, its spires, theaters, and churches, all destroyed. He felt an almost physical ache, a sensation of being unmoored from the very purpose that had driven him into war. The certainty of victory he had once carried as a soldier had evaporated in the smoke-filled streets. It was replaced with an unsettling question. If this could happen to Dresden, what could not? For the first time he considered the moral dimension of the war. Was victory worth the annihilation of entire cities? Could a campaign of such destruction ever be justified? His military training offered no guidance, his orders no comfort. The firestorm had revealed the limits of strategy, the vulnerability of civilization, and the fragility of human life. For Kruger, it was not simply Dresden that had been destroyed. It was the very framework through which he had understood the war. The sound of distant bells, faint but insistent, reached him from beyond the ruin. A few had survived, cracked and damaged, yet still ringing faintly through the smoke. The sound was jarring, and almost cruel proof that life persisted even amidst total destruction. Kruger closed his eyes, feeling the emptiness of the streets and the weight of his own conscience pressing down upon him. For the first time in years he questioned not only the war, but the very ideals he had fought to uphold. In the hollowed streets of Dresden, Major Heinrich Kruger understood that victory could no longer be measured in strategy or conquest. It would now be measured in survival, in endurance, and in the fragile persistence of humanity amidst the ash. And as he walked on, the city around him silent but still smoldering, he felt a quiet, irrevocable shift within himself, a reckoning he could not ignore, and a doubt that would never leave him. Kruger moved deeper into the ruins, each step measured, careful, as though the ash beneath his boots might give way to something hidden. Another body, another fragment of life extinguished in the inferno. The streets resembled ghostly corridors, the skeletal remains of buildings framing his path, like silent sentinels. Smoke drifted in thin tendrils curling around exposed beams and shattered windows, giving the city an eerie, almost supernatural quality. He passed a group of civilians clustered around the remains of what had once been a bakery. Charred loaves of bread lay scattered among the rubble, their edges blackened and brittle. A young woman, face streaked with soot, pressed a small piece into her child's hand. Kruger watched silently, aware that gestures like this were now acts of quiet heroism, tiny flames of resilience amid overwhelming destruction. Everywhere he looked, he saw the aftermath of fire, terror, and despair. Scorched vehicles, furniture fused into unrecognizable lumps, and personal belongings reduced to ash. The city's grandeur, its Baroque architecture, theaters, churches, and marketplaces was gone, replaced by blackened frames, smoke-streaked walls, and the lingering echoes of human suffering. Dresden was no longer a city. It was a memorial of human vulnerability, a testament to the destructive power of war. Kruger came to a halt at the foot of a collapsed spire, the once majestic church, now a ruin of stone and twisted metal. He imagined the sound of bells, the murmurs of worshippers, the vibrant life that had animated the square. Now only silence remained, punctuated by the occasional crackle of smoldering wood. He felt the weight of history pressing down upon him, the realization that centuries of culture and memory could be erased in hours, leaving only ash and shadow. A child appeared from behind a broken wall, clutching a scorched doll. Their eyes met, and for a moment,
Kruger felt an almost unbearable connection, a reminder of the innocence destroyed, of futures cut short. He knelt, speaking softly, offering what comfort he could, though he knew it was fleeting. Around him the streets were filled with similar encounters, survivors clinging to fragments of life, soldiers assisting where they could, all navigating a landscape unrecognizable from the world that had existed the day before. Kruger continued walking, each step deeper into the city's heart, witnessing the full scope of destruction. Entire blocks had vanished, leaving voids where life once thrived. Smoke rose from hidden pockets of fire, and the air was thick with the tang of soot and burnt flesh. He saw soldiers and civilians working together, dragging debris, searching for survivors, or simply moving through the ruins with hollowed expressions. The human spirit persisted, fragile yet unbroken, even as the city itself lay in ruin. As he reached the riverbank, the Elbe reflected the gray sky and the blackened city in its still waters. Kruger paused, absorbing the enormity of what had happened. Dresden was not just a casualty of war. It was a statement, a deliberate act, that revealed the vulnerability of a nation and the limits of human endeavor. For the first time he fully grasped that the war he had believed in, fought for, and trusted, was no longer a contest of strategy or valor. It was a contest of endurance, morality, and survival against forces that could obliterate everything he had known and loved. Kruger exhaled slowly, the smoke stinging his lungs, and looked back at the ruined city. The streets were silent now, save for distant cries and the occasional groan of a collapsing wall. Dresden had become a city of ghosts, a monument to human suffering, and a reminder of the fragility of hope. He realized with a heavy heart that he would never see the war or victory the same way again.